Hello. So today I'm going to be talking about Chapter 19 of Indian Politics and Political Processes. This chapter focuses on the term minority and how crucial it is to understand this term in the context of Indian politics. So I published what this chapter is about on my website, which you can find in the video bio, but I'm just going to start off right away with my analysis of this chapter while trying to re-explain some terms that were discussed in the chapter. Nehru's interesting approach in protecting minority rights by not protecting them with proportional representation and reservations is a unique way of pushing for minority rights. This is a departure from the British Raj instituted recognized demarcation between minorities and the majority. Whereas in the new Free India, this demarcation is rejected for the sake of recognizing the minority as an impermanent group, and that it is impermanent and that it is fluid in its composition, which does not demarcate groups by their identities, but simply by their numerical power at the moment. So I want to analyze these two ideas of minority categorization. In terms of the numerical, the one where it is an impermanent marker of the minority, which is what the Free India follows, and in the social, which is the permanent marker of the minority because of the identity, which is what the British Raj exercised. So to put it in an analogy, let's say that the British Raj defined minorities as a box with contents inside. The box is the contents identification so everything inside the box is therefore considered a minority from a fixed perspective. Whether or not the contents are outside the box or not, it is still considered a minority because it belongs to the box that is called minority. Nehru instead urges India as an independent country to see the box labeled as minority as merely a vessel, that whatever is in the box is considered a minority at the time, but once the contents of the box are removed, they're no longer considered a part of the box, and therefore they're no longer a minority. By giving allocated rights to groups like Muslims simply for their identity, for the basis of being considered a minority, it undermines the fluidity that groups have from being considered a minority in one place and no longer being considered one in another place. This is a well thought out policy because if the term minority is based off of the numerical value of its composition, then when the day comes that the constituted minorities are no longer numerically inferior and instead are the numerical majority, then this group will no longer be treated as a group in need when in fact they have the power at that moment. But following the social idea of minority categorization then risk providing this group both a majority that they have at the moment, as well as any additional minority rights that they are entitled to, which gives them disproportionate power over the others, which ironically becomes majoritarianism via the old minorities. A historical example we can connect this to is the demolition of the Babri Masjid Mosque. We saw that minority rights were seized for the benefit of both Muslims and Hindus, and this is because social status has inappropriately been associated with minority status. Even if we look at the cultural historical context, as we can point to different frameworks when discussing which group, i.e. Muslims or Hindus, are the true minority of India. We can argue that Muslims are intrinsically the minorities of India because India, as a traditional society that dates back to the pre-colonial era, saw Hindu beliefs prevail in governance and social norms. But the same argument of cultural historical context to define the intrinsic value nature of being a minority has also been flipped on its head and has also saw that Hindus have been seen as the real minority when we look at the methods of appeasement to the other groups, including Muslims during the British Raj and into the Free India. So this argument has definitely been employed by the BJP, which culminated in the demolition of the Babri Masjid Mosque. And this shows the big caution we should have in the discourse of minority politics in referring to minorities for their cultural/social status versus their numerical status, which is a bit more easier to maneuver. The term minority also invites India to remain divided on the basis of majority-minority balance. But is it necessarily a good thing to want to retain the differences of people as was done by the British? The British were seen as the oppressors of Indian voices. But once India attained independence, the question then became, who was the rightful leader of India? The majority tends to fill the power vacuum as the ones who win in the democratic process, and the Hindus have been the majority group for the nation as a whole since then. Let's recall the example of the Sikhs, because the Sikhs were not numerically superior in the British Raj, but they were allocated minority rights on the basis of their social identity. In post-partition India, the Hindus became the clear majority, which in this case casted Sikhs as a minority to a now independent Hindu majority-led India, which wasn't too different to the one of before where they still were not a majority at all. But in order to maintain their protected status that they had in the British Raj, the Sikhs turned to minority politics as the only way of protecting their rights in this new India. But the Indian state did not give them these rights. Were the policies that the Indian state that they did not allocate in terms of the proportional representation, or even giving them the Punjab state that would be a Sikh majority state, were they considered also oppressive in the same way as the British to the whole Indians were fighting against all those years? For Hindus, they might not believe so and instead might attach more legitimacy to this newly independent India that happened to work in their favor in terms of representation. But the Sikhs didn't see their rights being respected like how the British did when they intentionally divided them from the rest of the country for their own identity. From this, we should not necessarily perceive being treated differently as a negative concept in itself, because for a group like the Sikhs in the aftermath of partition, being treated differently from their country, India, was their aim, and it led to eventual separatist efforts and sentiments to protect their minority status. When it comes to using social identity as the marker for minority rights, the numbers don't matter here. What does matter is being a part of the discriminated group. That is the criteria. The issue that the Indian state has had to confront is which minority should be most valued at certain points. The Shah Bano case protest and the soon-passed Muslim Women Act is a clear example of the complexity in the state's position towards who they identify as a minority and whose rights should be affirmed, even at the cost of the other. The Muslim Women Act was a policy to guarantee Muslim women certain protections in the affairs of divorce and alimony, and this was passed to appease the unrest of conservative Muslim groups who saw the Shah Bano case verdict as interfering with the minority and secular rights of the Muslim Indians. To appease this group, this act was passed, but in turn, it upset the feminist group, who saw this as an encroachment on women's rights and a regressive move by the government towards conservative ideology. Both the feminist and Muslim groups here as a whole are widely considered minorities in Indian political discourses for their cultural identity to the mainstream Indian society and politics. Yet they have shown themselves to come at odds in positions, and once the opposite direction was taken with the Muslim Women Act of 2019, that supported enacting a uniform civil code for women. This one also now in reverse upset the Muslim women group, the conservative Muslim women groups, who saw this again as an encroachment on their rights of being Muslims in India. And what happened here was that the feminist groups end up supporting this because they saw this as the point of what they were trying to achieve in the state. So Nehru likely was concerned with this possibility of designated minorities on the social status level, and this probably explains why he aligned more with the numerical categorization of minorities, because it is more factual. We can't be upset at the fact that 1 is smaller than 3, but to say green is better than blue and to make that a law, that is more difficult, and it was essentially what it means to define minorities by their intrinsic identity. Because referring to women or Muslims as minorities simply for their identities not only demeans them in some aspects, but also creates this intra-conflict between the outlined minorities to which groups should be protected by the law, when they inevitably come at odds with each other. This argument is similar to a controversial issue I've heard before when asked if we should prioritize LGBT rights or economic stability. It is an uncomfortable dilemma because at the surface level, it sounds like you want to push one to the side or demean a category, which is usually why there is hesitancy to saying not prioritizing LGBT rights. But at a practical level, which one affects more people than the people who identify with the LGBT community, economic policy helps all the people in a given state. And this is to show that for something like prioritizing minorities' rights, will almost certainly come into conflict with another sensitive issue. And when it comes to prioritizing one minority over another minority, which is exactly what happened in this case of Indian women's rights versus Indian Muslims' rights, it becomes an uncomfortable situation where the state will have to make one decision that does support one group and unfortunately will go at odds with the other. This chapter also brought up how secularism was a tool used for protecting minority interests, and this raises concerns on whether the secular model is being appropriately harnessed for the topic of affirmative action. Let's keep in mind the model of affirmative action policies are based on uplifting groups for the sake of providing equal footing. This is why secularism is employed for the purpose of giving minorities a voice in legislative and executive efforts to protect minorities' interests. Some of these minority protection groups have also come to act as pressure groups, and this can be seen in the All India Muslim Majlis-e-Mushawarah group, which is also called AIM, and the Catholic Bishops' Conference of India, which is the CBCI, where they push for the interests of their respective minorities. Let's recall, though, that Indian secularism is aimed at providing all religions in India equal respect and tolerance, so as not to favor one over the other. Of course, during the post-partition years, religion was not seen as a criteria for minority subjugation, but it has been for the last 35 years, and this brings up a concerning dilemma. If minorities are to uplift themselves using the secular argument, the secular argument's other facet about treating all equally undermines the clear majority one group has in Indian politics. When we think about how organizations like AIM utilize secularism for defending Muslim interests as secular interests, does this not risk employing secularism as a way of showing support for one religion, or perhaps the general religious minorities of India, which include Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and all non-Hindu Indians? Secularism is aimed at treating all equally, regardless of the majority-minority status, but we have to be wary about the structure of secularism if it is to be recognized as a tool for establishing equality amongst religious affiliation, or as a tool for affirmative action, where this reaches the gray zone of no longer being impartial to religious diversity and instead becomes a tool to support minority religions, even though the majority is also part of the equally respective religions of minority protected under secularism. Regardless of if this is in effect or not, although the BJP might argue that this has been, especially up to the demolition of the Babri Masjid movement, the optics of secularism as a tool for minority upliftment is a cautionary tale about how institutions should be appropriately employed for minorities' rights at the cost of the national agenda. Representation of minorities is an honorable concept to carry out in government, as it does provide a sense of unity and belonging to those of the represented groups, but it doesn't always mean effective results for minorities. The Muzaffarnagar riots show how simply having representation of Muslims didn't remove Muslims from an unprotected minority status, nor did it necessarily hurt Muslims more to have them in power. What it showed was that actions speak louder than words, or violence speaks louder than representation. Representation's goals should be to strengthen minorities and their own goals. Again, this falls into the error of believing giving a seat or two to minorities means a body is now diverse and supports minorities. This falls into a fallacy of representation as a tokenistic solution. Strengthening minorities requires supporting an underrepresented group and enacting solutions that aim at providing the group real changes and opportunities, like an increase in political sway or the recognition of certain rights. Muslims may not have been in power in Muzaffarnagar, but the targeted killings to regular Muslims cannot be solved by giving Muslims rights on paper alone, but also through effective action and results, which ending the violence against them would have been a great action to have taken to prevent the tragedy that transpired. Coming slightly off from this topic, the fact that there is also less Muslim representation, yet Muslims still have a large electorate, demonstrates that there isn't a sense of solidarity in voting. Only for the representative voters can identify with the cultural basis, but it could also be that these voters were expressing a sense of national political identity and not so much the communal political identities that we tend to assume. This then poses the question, if these groups, such as Muslims in India, are beginning to feel more included in the national and state politics, and therefore this is a great thing that they are voting on policies rather than identities. But could it also be that these minority groups no longer feel connected to those that they vote for, to represent them, because there are no relatable options, and that perhaps the Indian nation has become less diverse and inclusive of its minorities in its political composition, which results in a not so inclusive electoral body which pays little attention to its minorities' constituents' concerns. We must heed these types of concerns because even though representation can at times be an ineffective on paper act, representation also matters for the people to have a sense of belonging. It's kind of like a first step, as well as a representative who heeds the concerns of the constituents, which is truly what we want in these representatives. Representation is thus such a complex topic that India has witnessed for both the benefit and the detriment of minorities. I think in the end, this all comes down to the question that minorities should ask, which is, what do they want within the larger group? Of course, there is no single answer to claim to be the all-encompassing solution to an array of people, but here in the Indian context, there is a question that needs to be answered. For example, whether minorities like Muslims and feminists want to preserve their identity at the cost of remaining distinct from the majority in power, or if they should integrate with the nation as a whole at the cost of losing their identity and possibly their minority rights. This is where harnessing a constitutional tool like secularism becomes a complex term, as it questions whether the Indian constitution should either protect distinctions or enforce equality. Some have answered which treatment they would like for their associated identity in the national dialogue, i.e. distinctions for Muslims with the triple talaq clause, or feminisms pushing for the equal rights of women. But others have also chosen to opt out of the Indian dialogue altogether, and instead have pushed for a total separation from the nation, i.e. Sikhs in the past, and there also remains other forms of separatism today in the northeast of India, to which the Indian state must answer these concerns with both rigor and pragmatism.